Hey everybody. This is going to be a quick sort of first impressions style review. I don't think I could do a proper review of this because I have not made my blanket out of it, washed it, seen how it wears for a few months. So generally, this is going to be what the yarn feels like and how it's been to work with. This is Red Heart all-in-one quilt motif. The color is nostalgia. It is quite a nostalgic colorway to me. It reminds me of the roller rink that I went to growing up. So, in terms of the yarn feel, it's not terrible. I don't like it. This is definitely part of my yarn work bias. I have not really used acrylic regularly in a few years. I prefer working with cotton or with wool. A lot of the wool I use is sock wool, so it is like 25% nylon. There's still plastic in that, but actual acrylic hasn't been something that I've worked with for a while. A good part of that reason is that I don't like how it feels in my hands, and I don't like how much drag it has when I'm working the stitches. But this is not bad. Probably, just call it pretty standard. This is not really gross and scratchy like some Red Heart Super Saver yarn I've used has been. This also isn't the softest acrylic I've ever felt. There's definitely some kind of machine residue on the yarn. It it's not something that's visible on my hands. Nothing like that. It's not sticky. It just feels like there's some kind of residue that my hands perceive, even though it doesn't look like there should be. This is normal. I'm fully expecting it to come out in the wash where I won't be able to feel that anymore, and it'll just be on my hands as I'm working with this. Other yarn types also come with this like spinning residue. That's just part of the manufacturing process. It's not a big deal. It's just kind of icky, but not so icky that I won't be able to do this project. It's just not a project I'm going to enjoy the feeling of making. But that is okay. We will persevere. I am going to be making a blanket out of this quilt motif yarn, not the one that's on this pattern. This is too small for what I wanted. I'm going to be making the pattern that's on the Yarnspirations website. I will link it below. That's 6 squares tall by 6 squares wide. So 36 squares. Eventually, I ordered 8 of the quilt motifs and 1 extra skein in charcoal, which the blog post about their multicolored yarn says is the Super Saver color that will match this gray tone. My lighting is not the best, but hopefully you're able to see that this is not black. It's not even a color I would call charcoal. It's darker than medium gray, but it's definitely closer to medium gray than it is to black. The gold color I think is showing up fairly accurate in my preview. This greeny, bluey, tealy color in real life is slightly more green than the camera is picking up, but not too bad, just a slightly different undertone to it. The pink is looking a little washed out in this recording, both on the label and the actual yarn. in person, it's more saturated than this. I do actually really like that the yarn is packed with an easy start. In order to get the colors to pool in the way that they're meant to, you have to do a center pull. And I'm just very fond of this tiny little tail with this tiny, tiny little bit of white yarn to start. All right, so the two videos I watched that covered this yarn before I bought it, both of them said that the 5.5 millimeter hook that the yarn recommends was not working at all for them, and that they had success using a 5 millimeter hook. The general impression I received was that if your tension is incredibly tight, that you probably would have success with a 5.5 millimeter hook. I believe in my heart of hearts that I have perfectly normal tension. I don't find it hard to pull through my stitches, and I don't feel like my stitches are loose and gapey when all is said and done. My kitty is joining us. I don't know if you can catch her on the mic. This is the first square that I made. So this is the first square that I have done in any of the all-in-one yarns. I did this with a 5 millimeter hook at my normal regular tension. The excess squares that I was getting in the color are a little subtle here, more noticeable here, and then hopefully by the end you can see how much extra yarn I had left over. So this was fully an experimental square. I know I'm going to have to take it apart. That was the plan from the beginning. I just wanted to test out what using this yarn was going to be like. I tried a 5 millimeter hook in good faith. It's not going to work out for me. The amount of manual loosening of my tension that I would have to do with a 5 millimeter hook in order to get this square to be actually the square pattern would not at all be worth not having to weave in the ends. But this first square, 5 millimeter hook. I have not washed this. I do expect it to relax a little bit. It's quite, don't know if you can tell, it's quite stiff. This I would definitely describe as being cardboard-like. I don't know if you've ever experienced that with your crochet, particularly something that's all single crochets. It's just really stiff and doesn't move. This definitely has that feel to it. So this square is 8.5 inches wide, ever so slightly more than 8.5 inches tall, plus an unrealistic extra triangle appendage. I've tugged on it a little bit, and that was last night. It has shrunk back down to 8.5 by 8.5, so it seems pretty happy there. I have since done a full square using a 5.5 millimeter hook and also adjusting my tension per color to try and make it line up. Which is this square. Let me try and orient them into the same direction so you can more easily compare. Significantly bigger, obviously. I'm not concerned about the extra gray yarn, so the last corner was actually very relaxed to make. This one, when we go over how much extra I had for each color, this last gray is a little bit exaggerated because I wouldn't have to keep making the square until all the yarn was used up. I just have to keep making the square until the corner is completed. So I didn't have to worry about trying to use up this amount of yarn in my second square. I just made this 10 minutes ago. So even though I tugged on it a little, it hasn't really had time to shrink back down. It is not drapey. Never could call it that. But it's has a lot more movement, and it's a little hard to see. Maybe you can see in the pink and the yellow, there are visible gaps in between the corner to corner blocks. I did the pattern exactly as written on the yarn label for both of these. So 9.5 across, ever so slightly more than 9.5 tall. But more importantly, I don't have an extra appendage. The square is actually a completed square. Using the 5mm hook with my regular tension, not trying to make the color pool, I had one extra square, or one extra block in the first gold. There were 2 extra blocks in the first gray, 2.5 extra blocks more than there should have been with the pink. This middle section was fairly excessive. I had 5.5 extra here. 2.5 extra for the teal, so exactly the same amount of overage as with the pink. This next gray was 3.5 extra, so much better than that center stripe. Last gold was identical to the first one. If you make allowances for the bizarre shape that I had to do to demonstrate the extras I was getting, there is one more block in the last gold section than there should be. So in terms of the dye job, that was very consistent. And then the last gray had 4.5 extra blocks, but obviously that's not really the case. I would be able to stop whenever, as long as there was sufficient yarn, and there definitely was. There's extra yarn the whole way through. I'll include the footage of me making this secondary square. I'll have the footage sped up so that you're not watching me in real time. I don't think it's that interesting. My strategy that I found most effective was making the chains looser. So every block starts with 3 chains of height. That was where I found I was able to absorb most of the length that I would need through the whole stripe without it being annoying or unnatural for me during the process. This square with my normal tension took me 43 minutes to get to the halfway point, the diagonal, and I completed the full square in 1 hour and 29 minutes. It took longer to add this little triangle bit onto it, but I didn't count that because this was the amount of stitches that the square required. It took me 1 hour and a half to make it. I was prepared for this square where I actually had to go back, redo, ensure that it was coming out appropriately. I thought it would take me much longer than it did. It took me 1 hour and 43 minutes. So 14 minutes difference between working at my regular pace without having to backtrack and having to redo several of these rows in order to loosen things up. In a few cases, tighten things up. Kind of split on that. That's not bad. I expected it to be much more of a headache to get the color to pool. This is my first color pooling project in any kind of yarn. So it does take more effort, but with the colors being such distinct patches and this corner to corner square, like the maximum width that I was working on, it's pretty small, it's pretty manageable. It did not take that much time to undo rows and redo them. Very pleasant surprise. That's all I have for the review. If you are used to acrylic, this will feel like normal acrylic. It's not at all scratchy. Even trying to account for the like slight, it feels oily, even though my hands don't feel oily afterwards. The yarn has a tiny bit of that oily feel. So even excluding that, that is probably making things feel a little slicker than intended. It's not excessively fuzzy. It's not supremely smooth. It does not feel as gross as anti-pilling yarn that I've used before. That one felt very, very icky on my hands. This doesn't approach that level. Yeah, if you like the colors, if you enjoy doing corner to corner, and you're fine working with acrylic, I provisionally really recommend this yarn. It is not at all been a headache to work with. I expect that it's going to wash and wear well. That is the supreme purpose of acrylic. And I really like this particular colorway. That is the other thing. I have found previous all-in-one yarns had hideous color schemes, and there was nothing that I liked that they had put together. This one is the one I liked the most, so it's the one I bought for myself. But I think that with the Quilt Motif line, they put together a couple more like harmonious colorways that are gonna look nice and work well for a wider variety of projects. I think they did some good updates with this one. The other reason that I bought the charcoal skein of Super Saver is to put my blanket together. My plan for that is to use the plain charcoal in order to seam up all the squares. I'll give you a little bit of a lopsided preview of what that could look like. Gonna seam up all the squares according to the orientation in the pattern. I do like how the Yarnspiration Designs looks. I will have that linked below. Free pattern, free download. I'm going to use the charcoal to seam everything up together. I'm going to use the 4 remaining squares that I will have left in my final skein. I only need to make 1 square out of that one. So with the excess, I'm going to do a border around the whole thing that will be color changing, sort of like pulsed colors around, and the plain charcoal skein is to finish that border. The remnants of the skein will not be enough to complete the border on the blanket, but I will be happy to fill in with charcoal. It probably won't even be noticeable as a second yarn. All right, I'm gonna start the time lapse of me working on this square now. Hopefully this was some kind of useful. I was not able to find a lot of content on this yarn before I bought it. Hopefully this helps. Have a good one, everyone.
just don't know what I'm supposed to do.